Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I've already been introduced, so I'll just go ahead and start. The talk itself is about research data management oh, sorry, from conceptualization to implementation. So I'll give you a bit of a overview of what the presentation is about. We'll discuss what research data are. Then I'll go on to unpack the concept of research data management. Then I'll go through a brief history of research data management, followed by a conceptualization of a research data management system. And then finally, I'll drive this point home by addressing the implementation of research data management at Rose University. So first things first, what are research data? I think the starting point for this should actually be the definition of data, and data can actually just be defined as symbols that represent properties of objects, events, and their environments. So you can see this framed within the context of the DIKW pyramid that you see on the screens there. And from there, you can actually then derive a definition of research data. I'm very big on definitions for some reason. So data take on different forms. So you can find numbers, text, audio, images, as well as videos. So what are research data then? Well, they're basically any data that are collected or generated for the purpose of analysis in order to generate or validate scientific claims. And if you see on the screen there, you'll see that they take different types of file formats, so to speak. So they do come in different shapes and forms, so to speak. From there on, we can move on to look at what research data management actually entails. What is research data management? So generally speaking, research data management can be defined through the use of research data life cycles, and there are different types of life cycles. You get simple ones, you get complicated ones, more complicated ones, simplified ones, and things that look like that. But it suffices to point out that they chart the path of research data during the course of a research project, from the inception to the end of the project. And it is a life cycle due to the reason that there's a continuum here, a continuous life cycle. So when the project comes to an end, it's not as if everything stops. The data do live on. Now, it is important to draw a distinction between the research lifecycle on the one hand and the data lifecycle on the other hand. So you can view this as two sides of a coin. On the one side, you've got the research lifecycle, which is predominantly where most researchers find themselves, in which case they're actually occupied with producing a research output, such as a journal article, or it could be a book chapter by way of example. Whereas on the other side of the coin, you have the data lifecycle. Now, there are some overlaps between these two life cycles. You will find things such as data collection, data processing, and data analysis appearing in both life cycles. However, if you focus on the end product, you'll see that in the data life cycle, the end product is actually the research data themselves, unlike in the research life cycle where you're focusing on research publication and you basically neglect the research data after the project comes to an end. Now, one thing that should be taken into account is data management planning as well. This isn't necessarily part of the data lifecycle for the simple fact that the data do not exist. So you actually need to plan first before the data lifecycle actually commences. So if you add that to the lifecycle, then you wind up with a 6-phase research data management lifecycle. So you merge that together, go from a 5-step lifecycle to a 6-step lifecycle. Now, this is just a generalized life cycle. This is not of application at the domain level. If you go into various academic disciplines, you'll find that they may have their own versions of a research data management life cycle. So this is just a generalized life cycle that I conceptualized, but it does actually simplify the process. You plan the process, and then you actually control everything else that appears in the life cycle. The good thing about using a life cycle like this is that you can then derive a definition of research data management that is actually based on the life cycle itself, thereby allowing a researcher to actually understand everything that they're doing within every single step of the life cycle. So based on that life cycle, the definition that we can derive for research data management is that is basically a process, which should be fairly obvious if we're dealing with the life cycle. But it's a process that entails two things. Firstly, planning for the manner in which the research data will be managed during and after a research project. That's basically the data management part, the first step. And then everything else follows, that is controlling the collection, processing, analysis, sharing, dissemination, curation, and reuse of the research data. It's also important then to take into consideration the goals of research data management. There are actually three goals here. The first one is that researchers should at least take into cognizance these three goals. They should ensure that research data management exists in order to ensure that data are capable of supporting the analysis after the research project has come to an end and during the process. Secondly, to ensure that all operations performed on the data are traceable. So there needs to be a provenance record after a project has ended, or even during the project. Someone should be able to trace the steps. This facilitates reproducibility after a research project has actually been completed. And then thirdly, in order to facilitate use of the data by people other than those involved in the project. So this is basically reuse. So if you look at a supervisor supervising somebody, a student, the supervisor should be able to use that data, or at least make sense of it during the research project. But after the project has been completed, it should be possible for other people to reuse the data. They don't need to have been part of the research project in order to be able to use that research data. And the use of the data should not be restricted to only the actual researcher. So generally people ask or assume that maybe research data management might be a new concept. So it's worth just briefly going through a brief history of research data management. It's not necessarily something that's new. In fact, if anything, research data management has probably been around for as long as scientific research has actually been around. It's just that it took on different forms. People used different types of scientific instruments in order to conduct their research. And there was probably a time when they produced the results on scrolls. And now we've moved on to books, and from that to electronic media. And if you look at the days of science present, you find that research data management has now taken on a more computational nature. It's very data intensive, so to speak. So there has been a transformation, but that's about it. It's not as if it's something that just recently emerged. I will provide some more examples by looking at past practices by scientists, history of clinical data management, history of research data archives, and then some more recent developments, just to hammer this point home. So the example that I found here is one of Charles Darwin. When he conducted his research, he kept field notebooks. This is a bit of a form of data documentation, but he was practicing a form of research data management by capturing his recordings in field notebooks. There's also the example of Alexander Fleming, the scientist behind the discovery of penicillin. He kept lab notebooks that were actually digitized, as you can see over there. That's a form of data documentation. He was practicing research data management. There's Anne McLaren's lab notebooks that date as far back as I think it's the 1950s, all the way up to the 1970s. She conducted research in the field of in vitro fertilization, and she kept lab notebooks. Now, this will be standard if you're actually dealing with medical sciences, but that's obviously a form of research data management there. If you look at clinical data management, this has something that has been around for decades. You can trace it as far back as the 1970s and maybe even earlier. In the medical and health sciences, as well as pharmaceutical companies, this is something that they actually do adopt. Then there's also the issue of the earliest research data archives that have been around for decades. The first archive, data archive, is the Roper Center, which was actually it was set up in the 1940s, but only went live in 1957. Another example is the Central Archive in Germany, which went live in 1960. Another example here is the ICPSR, which still exists, that was set up in 1962 in the US. And then the final one is a Dutch archive, I think it's the Steinmetz archive, which was set up in the 60s, but it's since been incorporated to the NISI. what I want to point out is that these were data archives. So they did not necessarily exist in order to make the data openly accessible per se. The idea was actually to make sure that the research data actually has some long-term longevity, so to speak. So that was a form of long-term, not preservation, but long-term data archiving, so to speak. Now, if you fast forward to where we are now, at least maybe if you look at the last 2 decades, you'll probably observe that there's been a recent convergence of two trends. On the one hand, you've had an explosion of data, and not just in the field of research data per se, but data in the general sense. A lot of data has generally been produced globally, and it seems as if the amount of data that is produced will probably increase unless the trend changes. We can expect this to be something that continues to the foreseeable future. And then on the other hand, what you have is the open access publication movement. This is something that emerged at least within the last 2 decades, and it advocates for making scholarly publications open accessible in the sense that the only barrier for a person to actually access scholarly publications should be their the access to the internet. So provided that they have access to the internet, they should be able to access scholarly publications without actually having to pay money via some kind of paywall. Now, this is something that has then raised the question. It's actually had a spillover effect. As open science has spilled over to open data, or at least open access and open data are subsets of open science. But the question that arises is, if the scholarly publications have to be made open accessible, what about the research data that actually underpin those scholarly publications? How do you actually interrogate the data in order to validate whether or not the scientific claims are accurate, right? And it is worth pointing out at this point that research data management and open data are not necessarily the same thing, though, but there are those overlaps between the two. So what you find is that research data management leads to some research data being made open accessible, but that's not always the case. Now, you'll recall that I actually pointed out that there are 3 goals of research data management. I'd like to focus on the third one, which is the goal that focuses on reuse of research data. Now, in terms of conceptualizing research data management system, from a library perspective, what you're trying to do is aim towards making the data that can be made open accessible, open. So when you set up such a system, there's certain things that you actually need to take into account. The first thing that I'd just like to do is at least define a system in this case. It's just a general definition I pulled off the internet. It's basically a set of things working together as parts of a mechanism or an interconnected network, a complex whole. And this goes back to that life cycle that I actually showed, which has different parts of the life cycle that actually intersect or connect to form an entire life cycle. So if we go back to that life cycle, this is what it looks like. The individual steps are connected into one whole. That was a simplification, by the way. If you actually peered into each of those stages, you'll find that they have several subcomponents. But we don't need to actually get into the details of those components. It's just suffices to point out that this was a generalization of that information, so to speak. Now, if you wanted to actually implement a system, a research data management system, there are 3 areas that need to be taken into account. This may be seen as functional areas. There has to be a governance framework, that is the policies and regulations that underpin the system. There has to be consideration of the technological solutions that are actually obviously supported or influenced by the governance framework. And then thirdly, you have the services that actually support the technological solutions. That's the tech stack. Now, these functional areas or layers can actually be merged with that 6-stage life cycle. So essentially what you wind up with is something that looks almost like a 3-dimensional cake. It's a bit difficult to actually visualize graphically here, so I prefer to actually visualize it in tabular form. But what you'll find is that in any given step of the research data management lifecycle, there's a component of a governance framework, technological solutions, and services. So those two get merged together. Now, let's actually proceed to have a look at how one can view research data management at Rose University through the lens of that kind of framework. So I'll start off by considering the governance framework. So this isn't necessarily based on a historical account of how RDM developed at the university per se. It's based more on an assessment of research data management at the institution. Now, there are several things that have to be addressed when considering the governance framework. Firstly, one has to look at the RDM best practices. Secondly, legal compliance, so the laws and regulations. And then institutional regulatory documents, institutional policies or regulations or protocols, procedures, etc. So the most important best practices are governed by what are known as the fair data principles when you look at research data management. This basically entails that research data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. There isn't enough time to actually go into the subcomponents, but briefly summarize, the idea is that one should be able to find the data openly online. The data should have a DOI that allows someone to actually retrieve and access the data without having to pay for it. The data should also be interoperable, and the metadata describing the data should be understandable by everyone in the field. So if you look at the field of physics, for instance, anybody in physics should be able to understand the metadata. It might not be comprehensible, let's say, to a linguist or a historian, but within the domain itself, the metadata should be standardized in some form. And some aspects of interoperability actually have more to do with the machine level rather than with the metadata. And then more importantly, the data must be reusable. The data and the metadata must be reusable, meaning that somebody who accesses the data in the future must be able to make sense of the data, especially if they actually are in the same exact field. Now, I did point out that one of the goals of research data management could be to make research data open accessible, but that's not always possible. So what you want to do is to wind up on the top right-hand side with research data that are open and fair. However, sometimes what you find is that it's not possible, for instance, due to certain restrictions such as data privacy or intellectual property issues, the data may be deemed to be too sensitive. As a result, the data will be closed, even though they may be fair in the sense that they comply with the fair data principles. So you wind up on the bottom right-hand side. And if maybe researchers actually do not make use or adhere to proper data management practices, you can find that the data are not fair and they're also not closed. I mean, they're also closed, in which case you'd be on the bottom left-hand side. But for the most part, we'll probably find that some research data would be openly accessible, but they won't be fair in the sense that they do not comply with the fair data principles due to all sorts of reasons. Another set of best practices are the care data principles. These basically relate to indigenous knowledge, indigenous data, and the principles that people need to take into account if they're actually going to indigenous communities and then collecting research data. This is not something that is taken into account fully by the fair data principles, hence why the care data principles were actually developed. It is worth pointing out that these principles were developed in the last 10 years. When you look at the care principles, you can find that the research data can be care compliant, but they might not necessarily be compliant with the fair data principles. In some cases, or at least what you want is for research data to be both fair and care. Sometimes it can be fair but not care, or it can be fair but not fair. You just want to have both. The worst case scenario is when you don't have both. Now let's look at the relevant laws. There are different categories of laws. So I've actually just lumped them together or segmented them. Firstly, you have the intellectual property laws that have to be considered. So you have to look at your copyright laws, patent laws, trade secrets, in some cases, licenses, as well as the Protection, Promotion, Development, and Management of Indigenous Knowledge Act. So within the context of South Africa, one could argue that they've taken the care principles very seriously. That's not what influenced the legislation, but in South Africa, there is a piece of legislation that covers the manner in which indigenous knowledge is to actually be treated and protected. Then you have the issue of data privacy. In this case, the actual laws emanate from the Constitution. You have the PAPIA, that is the Protection of Personal Information Act, it is Act 4 of 2013. You have the National Health Act, and then you also have the GDPR, that's General Data Protection Regulations. That's from the European Union, but sometimes you do find that South African researchers can conduct research, and the data can be collected from European subjects. In such cases, then the GDPR would actually be applicable. The third category is access to information. The relevant law in this case would be, well, mainly is the Promotion of Access to Information Act, but it's actually derives its authority from the Constitution. There is a provision in the Constitution about promotion of access to information. And then finally, you have research contracts. These four categories are what one would actually have to take into account when actually formulating a governance framework relating to research data management. Now, at the institutional level, in terms of institutional regulations, this is now at Rose University, so I just did an assessment. There are at least 11 pieces of, I was about to say legislation, 11 policies at Rose University that states something about research data management, indirectly at least, so to speak. So they cover certain aspects of research data management, but we do not necessarily have a research data management policy at the university at the moment. Now, if you look at those 11 policies, you can group them into various categories of or areas that they address. So they address information access, risk management, intellectual property, information technology, privacy, collection development, and ethics. What this word cloud doesn't show you is the specific areas or parts of the research data management lifecycle that are actually addressed by these policies. So I took the liberty of looking at the institutional documents that exist, and then I sort of like plotted them against the different stages of the research data management lifecycle. So you can see gaps when you look at data management planning. There isn't anything that actually addresses that at the institution. If you look at data curation and data reuse, there are policies that address that thematically. But by and large, if you look at collection development, it doesn't necessarily address data curation and reuse. But what I do want to point out is that you can map the policies and their contents to different stages of the life cycle. You can take this concept or line of thinking a bit further by then identifying the gaps that actually exist. So the empty circles basically depict complete gaps where there's literally nothing at the institution that addresses certain aspects related to research data management, insofar as this relates to the life cycle. And the half-filled circles basically indicate that certain areas of research data management have only been addressed partially by the existing policies at the institution. So those gaps still need to actually be filled. Now, if one actually had to ask the question, well, what kind of documents should the university have in place in order to address research data management more thoroughly? You can see this, that generally you'd want to have a research data management policy. It would actually address every single stage of the life cycle. And you'd want to have this supplemented by a policy specifically for a research data repository. But this only addresses the latter half of the life cycle. That is after a project has come to an end, when you're sharing the data, curating the data, and reusing the data. Such a policy should at least be supplemented by terms and conditions of use, which have a bit more legal binding power, so to speak, as opposed to a policy. And then in terms of preserving the data for future purposes, you'd want to have a preservation policy. Now, everything there is in gray, just to indicate that those things are actually not in place here yet. So that was the governance framework. I'm now going to move on to the technological solutions. This is where it starts getting really interesting. So at the moment, from the library side, we do have information resource that is the Resource Data Management Library Guide, which provides a wealth of information about research data management. And then we do have an institutional research data repository into which the university's research data can actually be deposited and made open and accessible, provided that the data are not sensitive in nature. So here's a screenshot of that research data management library guide. Provides information about the research data lifecycle, data management plans, and then some information about the data repository. The library guide has actually been around for a couple of years, and I just pulled some statistics about the usage going as far back as 2021 up until present day. This is just to show evidence that it actually has been around, and it has a digital heartbeat, so to speak. It hasn't flatlined. The next thing now, and this part is perhaps a bit more important, has to do with the data repository itself. After you get the information, what do you do with it? What exists at Rose University? Now, there are different ways in which the library can at least actively support researchers when it comes to the management of research data after the conclusion of a project. So under the traditional model, a researcher would just generally publish a journal article and then nothing will be done with the research data. But under the current model, what you find is that the research data can also be submitted as supplementary data accompanying the journal article. In some cases, you can actually publish a data paper in a data journal. Or alternatively, research data, more comprehensive form of research data, can actually be deposited into a research data repository. And you can find that these can be generic third-party repositories in the sense that they're multidisciplinary. So an example of this is Dryad. It actually takes research data from several disciplines. Or you can have a more discipline-specific one, such as GenBank or the Protein Data Bank. These are all third-party repositories. But in all of these cases, even if a researcher were to use third-party options as opposed to Rose University's institutional data repository, which you see in purple there, we can actually link the research data to the data repository so that someone can actually go to the data repository, the institution, click the link, and then they will be directed to wherever the research data are hosted, be it a third-party domain-specific repository or a generic repository. The other option is simply deposit the data into Rose University's research data repository directly, which is more preferable simply because the data can be curated. Now, the data repository itself, let me just provide a bit more information about it without going into detail. The institutional data repository that we have is a Figshare-powered repository. So Figshare is a company that provides, amongst other things, research data solutions. So they basically provide software for data repositories. And we happen to have one of those data repositories here. This is what the interface actually looks like for anyone who's actually not seen it before. I decided to add this just for the benefit of those who may have not necessarily used it or may not be aware of this, or may not be aware of the existence of this repository. If you scroll down to that page, you can actually view the data sets, and there's several of those data sets. This is what they look like, or at least what the icons look like. I also pulled some stats related to the data sets, the repository. And the repository has been live for a couple of years. In this case, I just pulled the stats for the past year, at least from the 20th of October of last year to this year. And you can see that we've had at least over 49,000 views and over 6,000 downloads during that time period. Now, the top countries by views were actually the United States, interestingly enough, accounting for at least 86% of the views in the past year. Now, if you wanted to look at this geographically in terms of a map, this is what it actually appears like. You can see the USA obviously dominating, but interestingly enough, the lighter shades of blue there indicate the other countries where from which someone actually accessed the research data. So we've actually got quite a large footprint. And what I wanted to point out is that the repository is making the research data accessible to far more people than you might imagine, far more countries than you would probably imagine. I think if you look at that, the only country, I mean, continent that's not affected is probably Antarctica. I pinned that down to penguins not actually conducting research. Now, if you look at the last 4 years of data to get far more comprehensive data at least, and you map that out. So this is data that I actually pulled directly from the repository. What you'll see is that there is a concentration of searches, or at least views and downloads from South Africa itself, and as well as Western Europe. So if you look at the total users, I mean, total views, I believe, you can see that since the launch of the repository, I believe in 2020, it's had about over 153,000 views, over 32,000 downloads. And there's a views to downloads ratio of 0.20, which basically indicates that 20% of the data sets have actually received some form of downloads, or at least for every 10 views, you get 2 downloads. This is the composition of the items within the repository. So we have pure data sets, figures, which would also count as a form of research data. And collectively, these actually account for about 80% from what I can see there. But there are some things in the repository that are not, strictly speaking, research data. Let me just point that out. But this is a repository that hosts research data as well as some open accessible content, open educational resources, so to speak, to be more accurate. And then there might be some people, especially from, let's say, computer science, who might ask, well, question, what about the software aspect? Now, software not necessarily research data, strictly defined, but they are research enablers, so to speak. The good thing that I would like to point out is that this data repository does have some kind of integration with code repositories, such as GitHub, GitLab, as well as Bitbucket. So you can actually deposit your data into a code repository, and then you can pull that or push it into the data repository. So at least some of the metadata will appear in the institutional data repository, but the code will still reside in the code repository, which is a more ideal home for the software. Then the other thing I want to point out has to do with the PLOS, what's called the PLOS repository. Now, this is a public library of sciences. It's also a Figshare-powered repository, and it hosts research data for several institutions. This is a third-party option. And we have several of our research data sets there. And I actually had a look at this, and I pulled the data, and I just created a time lapse, which indicated that we have data sets dating as far back as 2007. I'm not going to press play, and you'll watch how our research data sets have been uploaded. In fact, this isn't just for PLOS, but for all the data sets in our repository. There was a bit of a gap between 2008 and 2011. I guess nothing went into PLOS then. But you can see the variety, it's not necessarily departments, it's just categories that Figshare has actually made use of. So they use a classification schema. And based on this, you have various categories that are not necessarily mapped to our academic departments. But you'll notice that over time, there was a lot of research data, or plenty of it, that was actually going into the PLOS data set, repository rather. We pulled about 820 of these. They account for more than 80% of the research data that are currently accessible via the university's data repository. And I should point out that there's far more research data that was generated by the university. I'm not just going to mention the figure, but I do know the figure. I'll keep that a secret. There's far more data that's actually out there that we would like to actually mirror. When I say mirror, I mean that we won't necessarily ingest the data, but we'll create a situation in which you'll find the metadata. When you click the link, you'll be directed to where the data are hosted. You can see during the year of the pandemic, the biological sciences dominated during that year. And we're still going, not this is interesting. So if people say that people have not been adherent to research data management practices, well, you can say that, well, there's empirical proof that that's not necessarily the case. There's plenty of data sets, they're just not hosted locally. And there are plenty of ways of skinning a cat. You can just get the metadata, and then you can actually mirror the metadata, so to speak, as opposed to always uploading the data sets, although that is the preferable option. And there we come to the end of that time lapse. Okay, about to finish off very soon, 5 minutes. Okay, so now if we look at the services, and that one should actually take into account, in a fully fledged system, the idea is you want to have services that support the technology and the underlying governance framework. So you'd want to have what are known as data stewardship services. That would be the reviewing of data management plans. You'd want to actually manage the data in a repository and curate the data. You'd also want this to be supported by user support services. That entails things such as consultations and associated training sessions. Now, at the university, this is in gray. The areas in gray are the things that are not in place. So within the various stages of the life cycle, we actually do manage the data in the repository, and we can curate the data when they're actually uploaded. It's not fully fledged yet, but in the future, what we want to do is have RDM consultations, RDM training sessions, as well as reviewing of data management plans. And I just want to point out that the person responsible for research data management is actually not me, it's actually Debbie Martindale. So to conclude, I just wanted to point out that I went through the definition of research data management, research data management, provided a brief history of RDM, and then conceptualization of RDM, and then we viewed research data management at Rose University through the lens of a conceptualized model. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Sam, I actually want to ask a question on behalf of editors and publishers. Not as researchers, all of this makes sense, but I just saw Ty Hornby here and running a new journal. How do they comply as journal editors with research data management? What do you expect people who establish journals to do? What do they need to put in place in their policies for research data management to secure their journal as such?
Well, sort of like in the hot seat. So my personal opinion is that, so a lot of publishers out there, journal publishers, they do actually have data policies and things of that sort in place. But if you actually look at the supplementary data sets, they're of very poor quality. They're actually not FAIR compliant, simply because you actually have the data sets, but there are no accompanying data documentation. So there's no README file, which is actually supposed to provide context about the data. And this is generally the case with all publishers. They don't actually require that someone submit data documentation to accompany the data files. So automatically the data are actually not FAIR compliant. And this is generally the case with just about with most publishers. What you would want is for the publishers to actually demand that the data be FAIR compliant. And it is possible to assess the degree to which the data are FAIR compliant. There are plenty of tools that you could use. You can get a DOI, and then you can run it through a FAIR evaluation tool, and you can assess or determine the degree to which a data set is actually FAIR compliant. So I think that the publishers would have to take that more seriously. But the reality is that all they need are the research data in order to publish the content. There's no one forcing them to actually be FAIR compliant. But if someone was to set up a journal from scratch, I'd say that in order to support FAIR data principles and good research data management practices, one would actually have to ask that the data must be fair, open and fair.
I have a few questions from online colleagues. The first one from Dr. Anthea Adams. She wants to know if the slides or the recordings will be made available for all postgrad students.
I believe that. I believe they will be. That's why I was careful in my previous response. Wait, I know the recordings will be made open accessible. I'm not so sure about the slides themselves. Are people interested in the slides? Would you like to see the time lapse again? Okay. All right. Sure. Yeah, but we can even put the time lapse on the library site or something.
Thank you, sir. And then we have a few comments from the palette. She says, with the international research, there are more things to think about. Virginia Governor Executive Order 30 is giving me a headache at the moment. And then from Prof. Sue McKenna, she wants to know if in CPHS we have lots of OER, should we be putting this in fiction?
Okay, so there's a difference between this fixture, the third-party repository that exists, and then we have the fixture powered repository. I would not put the data in fixture simply because the data are not curated at all. You just upload the data and that's it, meaning that you can have poor quality data being uploaded. Whereas if you deposited the data in a curated data repository, let's just say the institutional one, where the data are appraised and the metadata are enriched to ensure that the data are discoverable in the future, that would actually work. So a distinction has to be drawn between fixture.com and then the fixture powered repository such as ours. Ours support putting the data in a trustworthy data repository. Ours is not a trustworthy one officially in terms of the actual classification of data repositories, but we actually can curate the data as of yet. The other thing is for the open education repositories, open education resources, if you look at what it requires to become a trustworthy data repository, your data repository should only have research data and nothing else. And I have been involved in getting a data repository certified in my previous job at studies. What I want to point out is that you should only have research data because they meet certain criteria. Open educational resources would be assessed differently. They cannot be appraised in the same way as research data. They don't have to meet any fair data principle requirements. Essentially, a data repository that hosts something other than research data is uncertified.
Thank you, Sam. Then there are a few comments from the colleagues who found the session very useful. Thank you.